The region of Calabria, on the toe of Italy, has a violent history, having been conquered by a succession of empires over thousands of years. Its people have learned to protect themselves by forming secret clans and using guerrilla brutality to defeat their enemies. Nudging up against Sicily, this is the heartland of the Mafia. At its centre is the mountain town of Platy, Italy's so-called kidnap capital, where once the grandson of oil billionaire J. Paul Getty was held for ransom, his captors slicing off part of the boy's ear and sending it to a newspaper. For almost a century, families have left the poverty of Platy and made their way to Australia and the prosperous New South Wales country town of Griffith. Among them have been members of a secret society called the Family, or Ndrangheta, the Honoured Society. By the 1970s, some of the Platy migrants and their descendants were making great fortunes in Griffith from huge marijuana plantations. Until one good man, Donald Bruce Mackay, decided to oppose them. A hard-working small business operator and political candidate, Mackay objected loudly to the drug-growing operations. Ignoring anonymous threats to burn down his business and even to kill him, he continued to report what was happening to the government and the media.
What the police had been at. What were they doing?
Until a combination of a few corrupt police, an immoral politician, and ruthless criminals finally brought him down in what's been called Australia's first political assassination. The town of Griffith, here in southern New South Wales, is at the centre of one of Australia's most productive agricultural districts, the Murrumbidgee area. Here, prosperity has been built upon a great irrigation system, fed by the massive Snowy scheme that turned the mountain waters inland. Migrants are particularly drawn to the area, including many from the poor town of Platy in Italy's far south. The majority are hard-working, law-abiding people who labour to build a new life for their families. But a few of them maintain their mafia connections. Among them is a young man named Trimboli, who in 1931 has a son he christens Bruno, but who later calls himself Robert. Robert Trimboli has a normal Australian country childhood growing up here in Griffith, and at the age of 21 he marries an Australian girl from Sydney's North Shore. And over the next 10 years they have 4 children. Trimboli is a talented mechanic, but with few business skills and a weakness for gambling. In 1968, he declares bankruptcy. Terry Jones edited the local newspaper and got to know the Trimboli family very well.
Bob then hit the road, or about that time he hit the road and was moving amusement machines. And of course you've got to think about who controlled amusement machines, you know, these little gambling machines that were around.
But a few years later, at the age of 40, Trimboli suddenly comes into great wealth. In 1972, he opens a restaurant in Griffith called the Texan Tavern. Locals soon realise it's a front for a massive marijuana cropping and distribution operation. Bob Bottom, the author of the book Shadow of Shame, and Australia's leading mafia expert, explains Trimboli's role.
He wasn't the mafia boss of Griffith. There were other people who led the
section of the mafia society that was at Griffith. But let me tell you, there is not one Italian criminal selling marijuana on the streets of Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide or Brisbane. It's all done by established Australian crime syndicates, and Trimboli was the go-between.
Trimboli becomes a well-known gambler at Sydney's racetracks, betting hundreds of thousands of dollars in what's later identified as a money laundering operation to disguise drug-dealing profits as race winnings. About this time, Trimboli builds up his contacts in the New South Wales police hierarchy. In 1973, Trimboli, now known in the underworld as Aussie Bob, buys a series of other businesses and moves his family into a large new home in an upmarket area of Griffith. This is a time when many mansions are being built in the town. Cynical neighbours refer to some of them as the grass castles. The influx of drug money is now used to buy significant political influence. The popular local Member of Parliament and high-profile Immigration Minister Al Grasby continually insists there's no mafia operating in Griffith.
He related pretty well to the Anglo-Saxon side, but I mean, he was just revered by the Italian community. And they bankrolled his campaigns. Yeah, he was their champion.
In early 1974, Grasby visits Plati, where he's presented with the keys to the city. He then authorises Australian entry visas for several Calabrians previously banned from Australia because of their criminal connections. Griffith locals complain that both politicians and some police are protecting the drug-growing operations.
At Griffith itself, the police, in the local culture of the town, some not dishonestly, just turned a blind eye. Others were, and subsequently were proved to be more than that, and they were actually involved in covering up for those who were growing the marijuana and involved in other activities.
Finally, in February 1974, after sustained criticism, police raid a small marijuana farm at Tarbogan, near Griffith. It's owned by one Rocco Barbaro. Barbaro is arrested and charged with possession of an illegal drug. Next, an agricultural officer, Patrick Joseph Keenan, stumbles across another marijuana farm. He reports it to Griffith Detective Sergeant John Ellis. The next day, the agricultural officer receives a sinister visit from a stranger who somehow knows about the police report. Later that day, police raid the farm and arrest the owner. A few weeks later, another Griffith man, whose name is also Patrick Joseph Keenan, but who is no relation to the agricultural officer, is found dead in a roadside drain. The death is officially classed as accidental death by drowning. The owners of the raided farms then appear in court. They're fined and released on good behaviour bonds. Instead of the raided marijuana being burned, it's harvested by local Italians, and Robert Trimboli is seen to store some of it in a farm shed. Some years later, Griffith detective John Ellis will be found to have large sums of money in a number of bank accounts around New South Wales. He and two other Griffith detectives, John Robbins and Brian Borthwick, will be jailed for conspiring to pervert the course of justice. The marijuana growers appear to be untouchable, but these first raids actually mark the beginning of a serious challenge to their activities. It will come from an unlikely hero, a mild-mannered businessman and community leader, Donald Bruce Mackay. But no one is prepared for the coming events that will shock and disgust the nation. Donald Bruce Mackay was born in the riverina town of Griffith on September 13th, 1933. He's the third and the youngest child of Lennox and Phyllis Mackay, who operate a large Griffith furniture store. After his schooling in Sydney, he returns to Griffith and joins his brother in the family business, and 2 years later marries Barbara Dearman. He's a tall man and plays sport well. His favourites are squash and running. Donald and Barbara have 4 children and are involved in church activities and support a range of community organisations. Don Mackay's son Paul remembers when Don stood as the Liberal Party candidate in a series of elections.
Dad first got involved in politics in the late 60s, early 70s, and he ran for state parliament, I think maybe 3 times, and for federal parliament twice from memory. He was never elected, but he certainly polled a respectable vote, and in the 1974 election, the federal election, it was his preferences that got the National Party candidate over the line.
The man defeated by Mackay's preferences in that 1974 poll is none other than the popular local Labor member and Immigration Minister, Al Grasby.
When Al was defeated in an election, the Italians cried in the streets of Griffith.
During his political campaigning, voters constantly tell Mackay of their worries about the effect of the marijuana industry on the town's youth.
Once he came out publicly talking about the effects on young people of taking drugs, people came to him and gave him confidential information or good information on what was happening around Griffith. So that's when he started to take an interest in the marijuana trade.
Barbara Mackay is also incensed at what's going on, and she writes a letter of protest to the local newspaper in June 1974. Mackay's campaign especially targets Robert Trimboli's drug distribution activities. Driving through Griffith one day, an angry Trimboli suddenly shouts a warning to a Griffith detective in the street.
That bastard is shooting his mouth off.
And he said, if that bloody Mackay doesn't stop interfering with my children and running them down, he said, I'll shoot the bastard. You know, and he did say that. And that's the only time I ever heard Bob really go off, you know. And he said it to that detective.
You tell Mackay to back off or I'll shoot the bastard.
No way he would have done what he said, but he was that wild, you know.
Mackay begins receiving other threats.
He was told, you know, the way you're going, more or less, we'll burn you, we'll burn your business down.
But this is not Platy, and Don Mackay is not one to be intimidated.
Look, I've come across some more further information.
Throughout 1975, he continues to agitate against the drug lords, and he receives a stream of confidential tip-offs and other information from supporters.
Think this through.
He discusses the growing information files with his solicitor, Ian Salmon.
We discussed what to do with the information, and we did not trust the police in Griffith, for good reason. We did not trust anyone in the New South Wales Police Force, and we were unsure of the politicians too.
Okay, I appreciate your information.
When Mackay gets a tip-off about a massive cannabis plantation at nearby Coleambally, he travels to Sydney and gives a detailed brief to senior members of the New South Wales Police Drug Squad. In early November 1975, drug squad teams swoop on Griffith and raid the Coleambally farm. They're staggered at what they find. To this day, it's the largest single marijuana crop ever discovered in Australia. They also seize an arsenal of illegal guns and knives. A total of 5 men are arrested and charged, including a man named Francesco Sergi. When the Colliamboli case comes to trial 18 months later, in March 1977, all but Francesco Sergi are found guilty and given short prison terms.
After about 10 days of the trial, it became known that somebody related to one of the accused, Francesco Sergi, was on the jury. And rather than stop the trial proceeded with this juror that was related to one of the accused.
A retrial for Francesco Sergi is ordered. A few months later, it's officially recommended that a no bill be declared and that all charges be dropped. But the Colliamboli trial will have a more lasting significance because during proceedings, Donald Mackay is named as the person who gave information about the huge plantation to Sydney police. Robert Trimboli now knows that Mackay is the police informant.
I know the reporter of mine that went across that day to cover the trial came back and he said to me that I believe they've just signed Don Mackay's death warrant. It's as simple as that.
During the Colliamboli trial, police raid a second big cannabis plantation at Euston, west of Griffith. 4 men are arrested. The 2 raids have cost Trimboli's operation an estimated $90 million, the equivalent of hundreds of millions at today's values. Drug Squad police traced the marijuana from the Euston plantation to the streets of Sydney. There, they arrest a dealer whose $50,000 bail is posted by a police sergeant from Griffith, Arthur Liddell. Sometime later, Sergeant Liddell is found dead beside his overturned car near Griffith. On Friday, July 8th, news breaks in Griffith of the recommendation for the no bill. It appears there will be no retrial of Francesco Sergi over Colliamboli.
And it became so controversial that media, particularly from Melbourne and Sydney, descended on Griffith, and it was as a result of that that Griffith got its reputation as the pot capital of Australia.
According to a later Royal Commission, the first attempt to murder Donald Mackay came a few days later in the form of a setup.
Hello. Yeah, it's Don Mackay.
He received a phone call from a man by the name of Ray Adams, who wanted to meet Don at Jerilderie to buy a house full of floor coverings and furniture.
Mackay agrees to go to Jerilderie, but on the day of the meeting, Tuesday, July 12th, he's busy with other business, and his salesman, Bruce Pursehouse, goes instead. He drives to Jerilderie in Mackay's distinctive gold-coloured Ford sedan, and in a move that probably saves his life, he takes his elderly father-in-law for company.
We had to meet him in front of the Flag Inn motel in Jerilderie, and that's situated beside the post office. And we sort of got there and waiting and nobody showed up. Well, while we were sitting there, there was a car parked to our right on the opposite side of the road, opposite the tennis courts. And after a period of time, this particular white Falcon pulled out from opposite the tennis courts and come and parked 2 car spaces to our left in front of the post office. I actually turned the rear vision mirror so as I could sit there and look at him, because I remember making a comment to the father-in-law that, he's a bad-looking bugger. And after a period of time, this chap in the car beside us actually got out of the car and went into the post office with a big manila envelope. And he was dressed in really dressed up in a, blue suit with a brown pinstripe, really oiled down, greasy hair. Came out and stood on the front steps, and he's looking around, and he's looking at us, and we're looking at him. And he then went and got back in his car, sat there for a couple of minutes, backed out and headed off towards Griffith.
Mackay dismisses the incident as a hoax. However, as a Royal Commission will later find, a killing has been arranged. It's Friday, the 15th of July, 1977, and Donald Mackay goes to work at his furniture shop.
I went out to lunch on the Friday with Mum and my younger brother and Dad, and we had a nice lunch, and that was the last time I saw Dad.
Mackay has arranged to be home by 7 p.m. to babysit his young son as Barbara is going out.
Hello?
Yeah, it's only me. Listen, I'm just about to leave the office, but I'm going to go to the pub first, and then I'll definitely be home by 7, darling.
He phones her at home to reassure her he'll not be late.
Bye.
Around 5:30, he locks up the store and drives to the nearby Hotel Griffith for a drink. He parks the company's minivan in the hotel car park and heads for the bar. As he enters, one friend greets him with a shout of support.
Don, good on you, mate. Give it to those marijuana bastards.
He joins friends and together they discuss the lack of police action against a local cannabis grower.
I've got to go. Yeah, sure.
About 6:30, he walks through to the bottle shop to buy some wine.
Cask of Riesling, please.
He then walks across the now darkened car park to his minivan. It's believed his body is then heaved into the boot of a car and driven away. The murder only took a few seconds. It was very professional, quick and efficient, and there were no witnesses. But in an office in that building over there, local accountant Roy Binks was working late, and he heard something in the car park.
Well, I thought I heard a patron of the hotel being sick. I heard what I thought were groans of a person vomiting, and that probably went on a couple of times. And I also heard what I thought were a couple of short, sharp cracks, and that was it. It was finished.
In some cases where there is an execution, the body is deliberately left, you know, because it's a message to others. That is, if they execute one of their own. In the case of murdering an innocent who's at problem, they don't want the body found because it's less likely to lead to them.
Despite the efficiency of the murder, it will prove to be a massive miscalculation for those who ordered the hit. A national spotlight is about to be focused on Griffith. And sadly, what happened here in this car park will mark this town forever with a shameful stigma. In the 1970s, the police drug squad raids vast marijuana plantations in the New South Wales riverina town of Griffith. The raids are the result of a campaign by local businessman Donald Mackay. The Crusader is on his way home one evening in July 1977 when he's attacked and murdered. Back at his house, his wife Barbara is getting ready to go out. As 7 o'clock comes and goes, she becomes concerned. Don is always punctual. Several hours pass. Now she knows something is terribly wrong. She calls close friend and family solicitor Ian Salmon.
She did not want to ring around the whole town asking where her husband was, because that's not good publicity for an aspiring politician.
Hello.
Hi Ian, it's Barbara.
Hi, Bob.
Don's not home yet. He called me from work and said he was going to drop by the pub for a couple of drinks, but he promised he was going to be home by 7.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much, Bob.
You know what he's like, someone's probably in his ear.
Would you like me to go out and have a look around town for you?
Yes, Ian, I'd really appreciate that.
And look, don't worry, I'll get back to you later.
Okay.
Thanks, Ian.
Salmon sets out on a search of the town to see if he can find Don's car. At this stage, their son Paul is out on the town with friends and has no idea of the drama that's unfolding.
I think from memory I got home about midnight, and at that point, this is before the days of mobile phones, of course, and Mum didn't know where I was, and when I got home she was quite distressed.
What's wrong? What's wrong? What do you mean he's missing?
No one's seen him.
Mum had almost had a sixth sense that something that was drastically wrong, and I went looking for Dad with a couple of friends, because I had had an idea of the rough places where he could possibly be, and I couldn't find him. And I got home, came home again, and I think by that stage Mum had called the police.
The solicitor Ian Salmon continues to search, and about 1 a.m. he finds Mackay's van in the Griffith Hotel car park.
And I saw the shocking evidence of blood, and I also saw the imprint of his right hand on the glass. It was a freezing night, and the cold had etched his handprint.
There's also blood on the tyres, along the driver's side, on the mudguard, and even against a wooden paling fence against which the van was parked. There are some scuffle marks, traces of blood and hair, and 3 spent cartridges. Investigators are able to gather up blood samples equal to a couple of cupfuls of blood and match it to Don Mackay's blood type. The van is still locked, and police will later find the keys under the car directly below the keyhole on the driver's side. Inside, Mackay's briefcase is intact and undisturbed. By the following morning, Barbara Mackay is under no illusions as to what's happened to her husband.
She was trying to hold us together as a family as well, because by that time my sisters, who were at boarding school, had come home, and like any mother would, she was trying to sort of keep it together for the kids, I guess. But she was devastated.
When news of the murder breaks the next day, many of the people associated with the marijuana growers make it known publicly but they all have rock-solid alibis. Robert Trimboli can prove that he was in Sydney, dining out with a racehorse trainer. Trimboli also has an exceptionally solid alibi for the previous Tuesday, the day Mackay was supposed to go to Jerilderie. Detective Sergeant Joe Parrington arrives from Sydney to take charge of the case. With him is Detective Rick Campbell.
Sergeant Parrington recognised very early in the piece the various avenues of inquiry that were likely to arise. Clearly the drug area was one, and he brought detectives in from the drug arena. He realised that a lot of financial inquiries would probably have to be made, bank accounts searched and the like. So he brought some fraud squad people involved in it.
But the biggest problem he had was none of the Italian community would talk to him. Can't speak English. No, can't speak English. No, don't. No. So he ran into this code of silence.
This appears to be Australia's first political assassination, and it makes headlines around the nation. In Sydney, the corridors of power begin buzzing, and in state parliament, the opposition calls for a royal commission. The government goes into damage control. Some government spin doctors telephone key journalists, suggesting Mackay has run off with a woman. A $25,000 reward is gazetted, and posters are distributed headed with the word missing.
And everyone knew that Don, if he was alive, would have been home. So he was dead. So everyone knew that Don was gone.
But the investigating police have to stick to legal requirements and legal definitions of the terms missing and dead.
Whilst ever the individual is missing and declared they're only disappeared, we don't have a body, so we can't prove beyond all reasonable doubt death at that point in time.
In Griffith, the report that Mackay had not been murdered was spread around by the notoriously corrupt former detective, Fred Cray. Cray at the time was employed as a standover man by the Griffith-born merchant banker Frank Nugan, who was rumoured to be shipping Riverina marijuana to America.
Australia couldn't consume all the marijuana that was being grown in the Riverina, so some was obviously being exported, so it was very profitable.
3 weeks after the killing, the national media makes allegations about some local police, which shocks the public and is deeply embarrassing to the state government. Premier Neville Wran can hold out no longer, and he orders a full-scale royal commission to inquire into drug trafficking in New South Wales. It seems that Donald Mackay has achieved in death what he couldn't do in life. The respected Judge Philip Woodward is appointed, and the inquiry begins in August. In October, Woodward holds hearings in Griffith. Meanwhile, the police investigation continues. In October 1979, after 2 years of hearings and deliberations, the final report of Woodward's Royal Commission is tabled in State Parliament. He concludes that the secret Calabrian criminal society, known as the Honoured Society, has operated a lucrative marijuana growing operation and is responsible for the disappearance and murder of Donald Mackay. Woodward names 6 people as being influential members of the society. The only action ever taken against any of those named in Woodward's report occurs when Francesco Sergi is eventually retried and jailed for his part in the Colliamboli plantation. The disillusioned judge will later declare the lack of subsequent government action obviously means his commission was not intended to be a serious inquiry.
I'm afraid that it's like many commissions that are established by the government. It's never intended that they should find out too much, because anything that's found out which casts a slur upon
any part of the administration of the country or of the state is accepted without question by the government as a slur on them.
One of those named in the report, Tony Sergi, says he has no knowledge of the honoured society and protests his innocence in a TV interview with the ABC's Andrew Ollie.
You must have heard of Drangheta in your native Calabria.
I had, I was too young when I came from Calabria. I was 17. But I heard of this once Mr. Woodward asked me on the court. It's the first time I heard him. And after, you know, in the pipe, I was in the pipe. And I heard him now, you tell me now.
You deny then being any part of an organisation which is involved in growing and distributing drugs?
I never was involved.
Tony Sergi complained that he'd been accused without being charged and given a fair trial. Justice Woodward had a simple answer to that.
Yes, I think he has a genuine ground for complaint. I can't understand, however, why it's not put to rest by charging him.
But the frustrated detectives working on the investigation know that evidence uncovered by a Royal Commission is not necessarily strong enough to allow formal charges to be laid.
The evidence simply was not there.
Meanwhile, the police investigation appears to be making little progress in finding the actual killer. But then, a surprising stroke of luck leads Victorian police to an informer. He's an associate of Robert Trimboli's, and he's prepared to break the criminal code of silence. The Honoured Society has been found by a Royal Commission to have ordered Don Mackay's murder. In 1979, with still no one prosecuted for the murder of her husband, a grieving and angry Barbara Mackay decides to lift the stakes. With author Leslie Hicks, she writes a sensational book called The Appalling Silence that becomes an instant bestseller. Griffith is once again in the news, and Al Grasby again becomes involved.
It was Al Grasby who came to the rescue in concert with Bob Trimboli and produced a document which was publicised in a notorious story in a Sydney newspaper suggesting that, by then accepted that Mackay had been murdered, that in fact he had been murdered by his own family. It was extraordinary.
Mrs. Mackay was virtually accused of involvement in her
The
husband's
affair
murder.
causes a storm of protest, and eventually Grasby's charged with criminal defamation.
11 years ago, I was innocent when all this business began. So I was innocent 11 years ago. I was innocent 6 years ago. I'm innocent today. And of course, I will appeal.
Grasby appeals the verdict and is later acquitted, but his reputation is now in tatters. The years of defending people in grass castles have left their mark. With the Griffith marijuana industry closed down, Robert Trimboli, having escaped prosecution, moves on to even more lucrative drug dealing. He decides to muscle in on the heroin trade, run from Sydney by a ruthless New Zealander, Terence John Clark, otherwise known as Mr. Asia. When two drug couriers, Douglas and Isabel Wilson, tip off police about Trimboli's heroin dealings, they're promptly murdered. Trimboli refuses to answer questions about the murders on the grounds that anything he might say could incriminate him. In 1981, police phone taps revealed Trimboli being tipped off that police are about to arrest him. Trimboli calls his friend Kevin Lawrence.
And he said that I'm going to get the blame for, you know, everything, he always originally told me there was somebody higher up that, and he said that I'm going to leave, the country.
At the end of the day, it just depends on the terms.
An international manhunt begins, but it'll be years before Trimboli is found. By 1982, just when it appears Donald Mackay's killer will never be found, there's a surprising breakthrough. Police in Victoria arrest a Trimboli associate named Gianfranco Tizzoni after his car boot is found stuffed full of marijuana. Facing a long jail term, Tizzoni hints that he knows the details of a number of major crimes, including the Wilson murders.
So you admit to distributing marijuana?
Yes, yes.
How long have you been doing that for, Franco?
The Victorian detectives immediately put him into protective custody and begin milking him for information.
Who have you been distributing for?
Roberto. Bob Trimboli, yes.
What sort of money would we be talking, Franco? Millions of bucks?
He tells them he's been distributing marijuana in Victoria for Robert Trimboli since 1971.
About a month later.
He says that in May 1977, after the second big marijuana raid, he and Robert Trimboli attend a meeting in Griffith.
It's causing too much damage.
This guy's a clean skin. He's not going to take the money, Bob.
Well, set him up.
Set him up. Set him up.
Or put him in the ground.
Bob, take it easy, huh? Yeah.
It's cost us 25 mil so far.
Yeah, but this guy, he's got a lot of profile right now.
So you have a think about it, okay? And we'll talk again. I've got to go.
Okay, Bob.
Well, this is very big news that you dropped on us, Franco.
A month later, in June 1977, he says Trimboli told him a decision had been made.
That Mackay has got to go. Squagliare disappear, and the body never to be found.
He was to find someone to kill Mackay and dispose of the body.
That's right.
No traces.
That's right.
Tizzoni alleges he contacted a Melbourne gun dealer named George Joseph, who then helped him recruit a man named James Frederick Baisley.
And, we have a little job for you, and do you think we'll have any problems with this?
Yeah, no worries.
So I've got everything you need to know.
All right, that's
anything else?
Baisley was an enforcer with the notoriously tough Painters and Dockers Union. Tizzoni claims that at a meeting in a Melbourne cemetery, he gave Baisley information to identify Don Mackay. Within weeks, Mackay was dead.
Hello. How did you go? Yeah.
Tizzoni says he then paid Baisley $10,000 in cash.
You won't need that anymore. I'd rather not want to worry about him anymore.
Okay. Nice doing business. Look after yourself.
Police uncover firm evidence linking Baisley to the Wilson murders, and he's arrested. Meanwhile, Tizzoni continues to talk, and sometime later drops another bombshell, revealing Trimboli is hiding in France.
You mean Robert Trimboli?
See, Bob Trimboli, that's right.
You could then tell us where he is as we speak.
Detective Sergeant John McCaskill from the Victorian Bureau of Crime Intelligence remembers the moment.
So, Franco, would you...
Tizzoni offered to go to France, pay his own fare, and go and see Trimboli. He came back and he had Trimboli's name that he was using, I think it was White. He had his car number, the type of car, the address where he was living, and so we knew exactly where Trimboli was.
He has a woman there.
But before Trimboli can be tracked down and arrested, Victorian police chiefs decide their detectives may be seen to be getting too close to Tizzoni.
Well, he's there.
They order that Tizzoni be arrested immediately and charged with conspiracy to murder Donald Mackay.
And so he was taken back to Melbourne and charged. Now, as soon as he was charged, Trimboli, because it was all over the papers, over the news, Trimboli was on his way out of France.
Trimboli flew to Ireland and was arrested as soon as he landed. A large team of federal, New South Wales and Victorian police quickly flew out, armed with a detailed case for extradition. But the fugitive had again amassed an impressive legal team and managed to get away.
Unfortunately, the arrest of Trimboli in Ireland was tainted, and he was ordered to be released by the courts.
The Australian police are not permitted to follow or re-arrest Trimboli, and he quickly flees to Spain. He lives there for 5 years in exile. Finally, in May 1987, he dies aged 56. His body is returned to Australia. Even in death, Robert Trimboli's name is associated with violence.
Come on, hey. Come on, stop it, stop it! Come on!
As I'm sure you're aware,
The New South Wales Police Task Force has been kept in the dark about Tizzoni's confessions in Victoria, and when he finally hears about it, New South Wales detective Joe Parrington is furious.
We couldn't afford to let anyone know. Even in Victoria, we couldn't afford to let anyone else know because it's too dangerous. And an informant's life is at risk all the time. And that we've seen it in recent years where informants have been murdered. So we had to keep it very quiet.
Armed with Tizzoni's allegations, the New South Wales Police start a new search for Mackay's body.
Other investigations at that time indicated to us that the Murray River was probably the most likely disposal point, and we took a team of divers down there.
I'd say he's buried him. I always had a feeling around Picnic Point, which is this side of Griffith.
With no new leads, and Baisley, Tizzoni and the gun dealer Joseph in custody in Melbourne, the New South Wales Police send their files to the New South Wales coroner, and the long-awaited inquest gets underway in Griffith 7 years after the murder. The coroner rules that Mackay was probably killed for attempting to expose the marijuana growers of Griffith. Meanwhile in Melbourne, Baisley, Joseph and Tizzoni all appear before a committal hearing, charged with conspiracy to murder. Mackay's salesman Bruce Pursehouse appears and identifies Baisley as the man he saw waiting to meet Mackay in Jerilderie 3 days before the murder. Tizzoni, Baisley and the gun dealer George Joseph go on trial for conspiracy to murder. Joseph pleads guilty and gets 4 years. Tizzoni also pleads guilty and receives an 8-year sentence. He's released on parole, put into a witness protection program and dies some years later in Italy. Baisley was convicted of the Wilson murders and of conspiring to murder Donald Mackay and was sentenced to life in prison. He was released on parole aged 75 after serving 15 years. Despite overwhelming evidence, Baisley insists he was framed and continues to maintain to this day that he was not involved in any murders. In 1986, a special commission of inquiry under Mr. Justice Nagel criticises the New South Wales police investigation. The ruling is devastating to the detectives involved.
Oh, as far as I'm concerned, that every police officer from this state that had anything to do with the investigation did a damn good job and did the best they could with what they had at the time.
I don't believe that Joe Parrington would do anything wrong other than trying to catch a crook.
Donald Mackay's death brought international attention to Griffith. The world was fascinated by the mystery. At one point, the celebrity interviewer David Frost came to town to speak with Barbara Mackay. But despite all the attention and the damage it's done, there are still those in the district prepared to preserve the mafia culture of violence and retribution.
Do you understand?
do something about this prick because he's causing too much damage.
By the late 1980s, Robert Trimboli has died on the run in Spain, and James Frederick Baisley has been sentenced to life in prison. But Griffith still bears the stain of Don Mackay's murder. The townspeople rightly point to the fact that the mafia families form only a very small percentage of the Italian migrants and their descendants who've helped to build Griffith into a prosperous modern city. Mackay family friend Tom Marriott says their contribution is underrated.
The main reason that Griffith has gone on and to bigger and better things is that the kind of people who've come here are people who'll work hard and establish something, and then when they finish that they'll get headlong into something else. And these people have nothing to do with drugs.
But mafia-style killings still happen in Griffith from time to time. In 1994, Rocco Medici and Giuseppe Farina were shot and dumped in the Murrumbidgee River.
And these were men that had their hands tied behind their back, had been shot between the eyes and had their ears cut off.
In 2003, 1,000 Italian police raided Platì and arrested 220 alleged mafiosi, including the mayor, current and former town councillors, and the chief of police. From the time of Don's murder, Barbara Mackay fought to draw attention to the case.
There are unanswered questions, and I don't know whether all of those will be answered ever. Some of them we may just never have answers to.
It's been an extraordinary case. I mean, the headlines that came out of Griffith just speak for themselves, and they were just non-stop for a decade. The Don Mackay murder was probably the biggest crime, or a crime that was, got the most exposure of any crime that Australia has seen, I believe.
It was always referred to, and it still is today, as the Mackay disappearance, not murder, because much of the forensic evidence that was never made available in the initial 2-year period when it received not only state, national, but international attention.
It's really difficult sometimes when you're living here and you may be at a public function, or it could even be something as simple as attending someone's funeral, and you're standing there in a church and someone like standing immediately in front of you or behind you. That's hard.
I've always believed that there's always someone out there that knows something, and whether they just don't think it matters or whether they're fearful about talking about it, who knows?
I am convinced that Trimboli ordered the hit. Now, whether Trimboli was at the top of that order or not, I don't know. I would suspect maybe not. Yeah. Someone else in the Griffith area.
And I think there should be a memorial to Don. I'd like to see a huge memorial to Don and Barbara and have them holding hands like I've seen them many times when they're out socially.
As far as the hope of finding Dad's body, that will never evaporate. I mean, I don't like the word closure, but we've still never had a funeral service for Dad, and we would like to know where he is.
3 decades later, the mafia, who were really ultimately responsible, have got away with it.